Our scripture comes from John chapter 19, verses 1 through 16a. Then Pilate had Jesus taken and whipped. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and dressed him in a purple robe. Over and over they went up to him and said, "Greetings, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in his face. Pilate came out of the palace again and said to the Jewish leaders, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no grounds for the charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here's the man." When the chief priests and their deputies saw him, they shouted out, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate told them, "You take him and crucify him. I don't find any grounds for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders replied, "We have a law, and according to this law, he ought to die because he made himself out to be God's son." When Pilate heard this word, he was even more afraid. He went back into the residence and spoke to Jesus. "Where are you from?" Jesus didn't answer. So Pilate said, "You won't speak to me? Don't you know that I have authority to release you and also to crucify you?" Jesus replied, "You would have no authority over me if it had not been given to you from above. That's why the one who handed me over to you has greater sin." From that moment on, Pilate wanted to release Jesus. However, the Jewish leaders cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you aren't a friend of the emperor. Anyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he led Jesus out and seated him on the judge's bench at the place called Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. It was about noon on the preparation day for the Passover. Pilate said to the Jewish leaders, "Here's your king." The Jewish leaders cried out, "Take him away, crucify him." Pilate responded, "What? Do you want me to crucify your king?" "We have no king except the emperor," the chief priests answered. Then Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. The word of the Lord.
Let's sit with that for a while. For as many years as you've heard this, as many years as you're living, you've probably heard this story that many times. And yet, how do you hear it today? To what images of Jesus do we tend to gravitate? With what images of Jesus are you most comfortable? Healer? A welcomer of children? Maybe a teacher, maybe a peace advocate, someone who dwells on the margins, an immigrant. With what image are you most comfortable? And what is it that feeds those preferences that we have? And of course, if we ask that question, we have to ask that question as well. What image makes you squirm? What image or images of Jesus carry a level of difficulty that maybe you haven't even come to grips with yet? Arrested, silent, critical of religious stalwarts, submissive. How about the parables? Those are easy, aren't they? In what ways did Jesus desire to be seen? In what ways, especially as we hear this story today, in what ways did Jesus want to be known by? Did he prefer humanity or divinity? What do you think was his preference? Did he have one? As we follow John's depiction of Jesus through this story, there's a constant weaving back and forth between his humanity and his divinity. It's almost a tug, a pulling, similar to what we saw here between the pilots. The religious leaders want their perception of him to remain human, to stay as that local man from Nazareth. Being a good teacher would be all right. He's from a local family. But they definitely want him in their shadow. They would prefer not being in his shadow. But in this trial, in this presentation of Jesus before the leaders, with Pilate beside him, Jesus is also this persistent divine presence that just does not go away. It's always there, held alongside humanity. We see it in his responses. In Jesus' non-responses, we see it. In what appears, at least, to be a calm exterior. And these religious leaders are being forced to reckon with that. To reckon not just with his humanity, but especially with his divine nature. And as you can imagine, as we've known for so long, it was very threatening to them. Now, this was not only a threat to their power, but also to the very institutions that they held dear, the practices that they strived to live by for so many years. A threat to what had been taught. A threat to who they believe themselves to be as a people. That's what Jesus brought to this setting. What I believe was their biggest threat. We see Jesus as God incarnate in this setting. Actually, if you go back one chapter, Jesus knows all that will happen to him. That's scary. I don't know if the leaders knew that. He names it a number of times. But he talks about knowing what will happen to him, including the betrayal, the denial that he experienced, as well as the courtroom setting. Events happen that point to his divinity throughout the story that fulfill prophecy. Jesus in the story says to Pilate, "You would have no authority Excuse me. You would have no authority over me if it had not been given to you from above. So we have this glimpse of his divinity that's kind of in and amongst all this pain and suffering and hurt, this human dealings that he has. But we see Jesus as human as well. His suffering, his being vulnerable, his being broken and powerless, the humiliation that he goes through. Here's the man. Here's your king. We see this as an image of love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. What a love. A love that is not threatened by death. Love that has no boundaries. When efforts are made to offer truth-telling love, when efforts are made and that love is bound, is beaten, and killed out of ignorance or fear, out of greed, out of selfishness. Not only here in Jesus, but in all the situations. When this kind of love is attempted to be beaten down, that's never the end of the story. We know this natural practice that when a seed dies, it has to happen before fruit can be before it can bear fruit. And that's the power of the love that Jesus lives with here. Jesus embodies this suffering servant. His flesh, his character are torn. What happens now, though, if we focus not so much on the theological claim that Jesus' suffering was a tragedy because he was God's Son, but rather calling our focus to the fact that he suffered as a human. I would venture to say that we probably feel better this time of year. We can engage this story a little bit easier, knowing that Jesus is divine. But if we face his humanness, if we are front and center with him and we see the suffering, it's harder. It's harder to stay there. It'd be easier to turn away from that. Because at this point, we don't know the end of the story yet. We don't know what happens after this trial, after his crucifixion. All we know is that he's been sentenced to death. And in the midst of that, has been humiliated, has been falsely accused, and has had their back of the religious establishment turn against him. Such human suffering like this, as we're facing it, is ongoing in our lives. As we engage this suffering scene in John 19, we do so with the realization that all around us, there's incredible suffering going on. A suffering that holds a terrible weight for us. And at times, we don't know how to respond. We're paralyzed. At times, even though we're called to not turn away from Jesus, to not deny, to not betray, it's hard because we don't have an answer. We don't know how the story's going to end. There's the pain of injustice, pain of grief, watching a loved one die, watching a loved one suffer. Sitting with a friend yesterday at the funeral meal for Dr. Al Graber. A friend was here. He was a student, high school student, and I was a college student. And so I knew him and his wife very well. And about 14 months ago, his wife was tragically killed in a car accident. You can imagine 14 months isn't a whole lot of time. The grief was fresh, it was raw. And yet he sits there with this, a man of deep faith, and realizing that his dear wife had suffered greatly as a part of her passing. There's the pain of war, especially that war way over there somewhere that's so far away from us. How do we engage with that? Family conflicts. And the list could go on. You could name your own pains, conflicts, suffering that you're facing. How might we more meaningfully lament human suffering? And not just lament it, but allow it to be a part of our discipling. To be a part of our very commitment to follow Jesus. How can we have suffering be a part of that? That's a hard ask. We're held in this constant tension in this story between innocence and guilt, between Pilate and the Jewish leaders. We're pulled back and forth. It's a dissonance that is hard to come to grips with. Jesus' suffering is held in front of us. It doesn't go away. We want to stop it, but we can't. We want to turn away. But the reality of what Jesus went through physically stays before us. Our humanness, we want to point fingers. We keep trying, even in this story, we kind of try and point fingers at who's at fault here. Who's making this dear Jesus suffer? We do. We want to criminalize. We want to point fingers at the people that cause the pain, the suffering. It's hard. It's a hard go for us as followers of Jesus. It's a hard go to be disciples that are committed to never turning away from Jesus. It's hard. When we're faced with this kind of pain, we feel powerless. And that, to me, is a big ask for us. To give up the power that we feel we have, the agency that we have to say yes or no to Jesus, and we kind of lose it when we're kneeling before Jesus. And that holds true in the world around us. As we face pain, we face suffering, we face injustice. The things that just grind on us, and we feel powerless to know how to respond. I think an important part of our journey to the cross through Lent is the facing of the fact that Jesus was not only divine, but Jesus was also human like us. Our being at a distance. We weren't there that day. That was a long time ago. We've heard this story over and over. There's this distancing that really comes natural for us when we face stories like this. There's this distancing that happens very naturally that says, that's terrible. And then we go on with life. Like I said, we don't know the end of the story at this point yet. So how do we hold it without knowing the end of the story? But being removed from it like this, it develops sort of an innocence within us. It produces an innocence that we're challenged to give up. call it a blurring of sorts. It's an innocence that it's kind of nice to have. It's kind of nice to hold, but we're asked to give that up. We're asked to enter in to the life of Jesus. We're asked to enter into the death of Jesus. And as well into the resurrection of Jesus. It begs our not just standing before, but it begs our kneeling before Jesus. So how do we step forward? How do we take part, participate with this pain and suffering, this difficulty, this human aspect of Jesus' life? I call us to over and over again commit to never leaving, to commit to kneeling. The thing that's difficult about this kind of suffering that we see here compared to the suffering around us is that this begs us to come and kneel before this Jesus in worship and to give our lives in that way. I love that song, Beautiful Things. God makes beautiful things out of dust, out of us. And I think that love for all the world that came from God through Jesus is offered to us. And that is good news these days. Amen.